This week we're going to look in a little bit more detail at how markets behave in reality. We're going to add a little bit of complexity. So we recognise these demand and supply curves. The question is, do the demand and supply curves always look like this? Well, clearly the answer is no. Demand and supply curves will be different for different kinds of goods, and that's what we're going to look at today. And specifically, we're going to be looking at the concept of elasticity. And this measures how responsive one variable is to changes in another variable. So, for example, when the price rises, we know that demand will fall. Elasticity asks us by how much. Equally, when price rises, we know that supply will rise. But again, it doesn't rise by the same amount for all goods. So elasticity helps us to understand how different goods will behave, the demand for different goods and the supply for different goods will behave. So there are four basic types of elasticity, and in this video we're going to focus on price elasticity of demand. In the subsequent videos we'll learn about the others. So, price elasticity of demand. This, as you might expect, looks at the relationship between price and demand. So, for example, if the price of a good rises by 10%, we know that demand will fall, but how much will it fall? Will it fall by more than 10% or less than 10%? So elasticity measures the extent to which demand will change. So our definition here is that price elasticity of demand is the responsiveness of demand to changes in price. And we can look at different goods as being having either elastic demand or inelastic demand. So where the percentage change in demand is greater than the change in price, in other words, the price goes up and none of us want to buy it anymore, or the price goes down and we all want to buy more, then we say that demand is price elastic. On the other hand, where the percentage change in demand is less than the percentage change in price, we say that demand is inelastic. So in an example like milk, for example, the price might go up, but actually we all feel like we still need to buy it. So demand doesn't fall very much at all. Okay, there is a formula that enables us to calculate precisely the price elasticity of demand or of a good or a service. We don't need to worry about calculating this formula too much, but we do need to understand that if the elasticity of a good is described as 0 point something, then we say demand is inelastic. If the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1, in other words 1 point something, 2 point something, 3 point something, then we say demand is price elastic. Now, any elasticity calculation we make will result in a negative number because price and demand are inversely related. One goes up, the other goes down. So we ignore, for purposes of elasticity, we ignore the minus sign and we just think if it's 0 point something, demand is inelastic. If it's 1 point something or bigger than that, then demand is elastic. Don't worry about that too much. So, as in all things in economics, we can illustrate our elastic demand curves on a diagram. And we can see actually that the demand curve can be all kinds of different shapes, and these reflect the different elasticity of demand of different goods. And we're going to come back to this again later. So what determines whether a good is elastic in demand or inelastic? Well, these 6 things mainly. Whether it's got many substitutes, whether we need it or it's just a luxury, whether it costs us a large amount of our income or a small amount, whether we're talking about how demand changes right now, today, or how demand changes over a period of time, peak and off peak, and whether we're talking about a specific brand or the whole good. Let's look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So, number and closeness of substitutes. If we take a good like fuel that we put in our cars when we drive, all fuel looks the same, doesn't it? I don't mind where I get my fuel from. On the other hand, many of us are very fond of our phones, aren't we? And many of us who have iPhones wouldn't swap for an Android, and some of us who have Androids wouldn't swap for an iPhone. So the substitutes for fuel are very, very close, and there are very many of them. Fuel is fuel is fuel. It's all pretty much the same. So demand for fuel will be elastic because there are many substitutes. If the price of fuel at one petrol station goes up, I'll go to the next one. So demand at that particular retailer will fall. On the other hand, if the price of Android phones fall, will you all stop buying your iPhones? Probably not. So demand tends to be inelastic for goods like this that don't have very close substitutes. There are substitutes for phones, but they're not that close. We're quite loyal, especially to iOS or Android. How about whether something is necessary or a luxury? Well, if goods are necessary, then demand tends to be inelastic because if price goes up, we still need to buy them. On the other hand, if the price goes down, we're not all going to rush out and buy more medicine or more bread, are we? And in the opposite case, luxuries, if the price goes up, well, we don't need them, we won't buy them. On the other hand, if the price goes down, maybe we'll treat ourselves. And there's a link here between necessities and peak travel. That's also inelastic, and luxuries and off-peak, because when we travel in peak times, that tends to be because we need to. And so we'll still travel even when the price goes up. On the other hand, if we're travelling off-peak, that tends to be for luxury, for holidays, for pleasure. So if the price goes up, we don't have to maintain our demand. We could do something else. How about the proportion of income that we spend on a good? Well, imagine if prices of cars went up by 10%. We might not be able to afford it anymore because a 10% rise in the price of a car is a lot of money. On the other hand, if the price of your favourite burgers went up by 10%, actually that's not much money. You're probably still going to demand it. So demand for expensive items that take up a big proportion of our income tends to be elastic, whereas demand for cheaper items that take up a very small amount of our income tends to be inelastic because that price increase is not so much for us, so we're not going to reduce our demand. The time period is also important. Imagine, let's go back to our imaginary fuel. Imagine if the price of all fuel has risen. I still need to get to work, don't I? So I'm still going to have to buy fuel in order to get to work. However, as time gradually passes, I might start to think to myself, maybe I should buy an electric car. Or perhaps I should get rid of my car altogether and start travelling by train. So demand tends to be more inelastic in the short run and more elastic in the long run, because in the long run we have time to change our patterns of demand. We can do something different. Okay, so let's go back to our diagrams. Elastic demand looks like this on a diagram, and you can see here that the price here hasn't changed much at all, but the quantity demanded is changing a lot. So this shows us that a small change in price will lead to a big change in demand. On the other hand, inelastic demand tends to be very steep, and we have the opposite thing going on here. Small changes in, large changes in price, but very small changes in the quantity demanded. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned that not all goods react to changes in the market in the same way. And we call this idea elasticity. Elasticity measures the responsiveness of one variable to changes in another, and we've learned that there are 4 basic types. But in this video, we've focused on price elasticity of demand, which measures how responsive demand is to changes in price for different goods. We've learnt that some goods have elastic demand, which means that a relatively small change in price is likely to lead to a larger change in quantity demanded, whilst demand for other goods is price inelastic. So for inelastic goods, a large change in price is likely to result in a much smaller change in demand. We've also learned about the different determinants of price elasticity of demand, the things that cause demand to be either elastic or inelastic. For example, whether that good is a necessity or a luxury, how many substitutes it has, the proportion of our income that we spend on it, and so on. So, there are a few questions for you to answer now.